so much for the opportunity to be with you here this evening. Next month, on the 28th of June, dignitaries from around the world will gather in Sarajevo to commemorate the 100th anniversary of an event that was to bring so much calamity to Europe and to the world. 100 years ago, that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. The event that triggered the First World War and thereby laid the conditions for the Second World War also. I think that within our lifetimes, there will never be a better moment than this to reflect on the meaning of war and on our obligations to respond to war, both as states, as citizens, and as human beings. And I think that that's particularly true because, as we've already heard in the introductory remarks, something truly remarkable is happening in the history of human violence that we have only recently come to realize and understand. And that is that wars, genocides, and atrocities are diminishing. Every decade, less wars are being fought. The wars that are being fought are less intense and inflict fewer casualties. This seems to be true over a period of decades, over a period of centuries, and even over a period of millennia. It doesn't feel that way as we confront a world that contains the horrors of the civil war in Syria and the activities of Boko Haram. But as Steven Pinker argues in his book in 2011, The Better Angels of Our Nature, it does seem to be true, to be happening. There is extremely strong statistical database evidence to suggest that. But as Pinker argues, I think rightly in his book, there are a number of preconditions or causes for this diminution of war and violence. Some of them have to do with politics, some of them have to do with technology, and some of them, crucially, have to do with the field that I've spent my life thinking about and working on, which is about how we think about the ethics and the morality of violence. Because people kill in war not only when there is a political or technical reason for them to do so, but also because at some level they are able to believe that that war or that act of war is in that context and at that moment justified, even if only as the lesser evil. And over a long period of time, I have come to believe that the primary framework and body of thought through which we have addressed and thought about the ethics of war for over 1,500 years, the just war theory, so-called, is in a period of eclipse. Its usefulness is passing. And the task for our generation and the following ones is to discover and to establish and to build institutions around a new ethic of violence, one that fundamentally rejects the view implicit within just war theory that there is such a thing as a just war. So that's what I want to try and persuade you of tonight. But before I do that, I want to start with a personal story, and this is partly because I will be one of the people standing on that bridge next month on the 28th of June, which also bizarrely happens to be my birthday. I wanted to say a few words about how I came to be engaged in this rather peculiar field. I was born in New Zealand to a German mother and a Jewish-English father. My mother was born in Crimmitschau, close to Dresden, and she was 2 years old when the Second World War started. And like many of her generation, her life was really devastated by the war. She lost her mother. Her father was a soldier in the Bundeswehr. He fought on the Russian front and was a prisoner of war in Russia. He survived that experience, but came back to Germany years later, really a broken and devastated man. My mother grew up, I guess you would describe as a kind of an urchin, no real education, and in East Germany, impoverished by the war. She ended up crossing over to the West before the wall was erected and made her way there to England, where she met my father. Now, my father's life could not have been more different. He grew up the only child of a working class East End Jewish family. Their background had been in Latvia, where they had, his grandfather had fled persecution and pogroms in the 1890s. They'd end up in England, and my father had become a young academic in England. And as you can imagine, the relationship within marriage of a Jewish only child with a German woman did caused certain difficulties with his family. And I think they moved to New Zealand really to get as far away as possible from this background of trouble and strife that existed in continental Europe. Now, I grew up really in idyllic conditions in New Zealand, as far away as you can possibly be from all kinds of political conflict and violence. But that legacy of the war, the experience of my parents, was always present in our family growing up. I remember very vividly the moments of panic and terror that would sometimes overtake my mother if a plane unexpectedly flew over our house. And I remember the shame that she felt about the background, the fact that she would often tell us that she was not born in Germany, but rather in Poland. The fact that she never spoke German to me, which is the reason that I don't speak it now today. So that legacy, that realization that the effects of war can travel vast distances and can cast shadows down generations, never left me. And it left me with a huge motivation to try and address issues of war and conflict. So when I arrived in Oxford in the early 90s as an ambitious young philosopher, I desperately wanted to try and understand how we can address issues of war and conflict using the tools and mechanisms of rational analytical thought, how we can better understand the moral constructs that can be used to inform political institutions and laws so as to make our world a better and more peaceful place. And I soon discovered, working on my doctorate, that the ethics of war was dominated by a really remarkable body of intellectual theory that we know today as just war theory. Now this, I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with it, but for those who are not, I'll just say a few words about what it is and where it came from. Just war theory is a body of thought that was developed really by the early Christian thinkers, starting in the 4th century with St. Augustine. What these thinkers tried to do was to construct a way of thinking about the ethics of conflict that was a middle path between two prior bodies of thought. The first of those was the approach of realism, embodied by the writings of the Roman author Cicero. What realism said, Cicero memorably, as he put it, he said that in the times of war, the law is silent. That war is somehow a domain apart in which moral and perhaps even legal judgment is just meaningless. It is a realm and a domain of pure force and violence in which it is simply impossible to make any judgment. At the other extreme, we had the tradition of pacifism, exemplified, of course, by the teachings of Jesus. And what the pacifists said was that war had to be subject to moral assessment, but that moral assessment always denied the possibility of any violence. As Jesus taught, we had an obligation when attacked to turn the other cheek, to love one's enemy, and to not use violence. Just war theory was an attempt to forge a middle path between those two. It was an attempt to articulate how statesmen and soldiers at war had a set of both war rights, of permissions to do things morally permissibly within war, but equally had a set of moral responsibilities or obligations. So against the realists, they insisted that there were genuine obligations within war, and therefore things that you could be morally and legally criticized or condemned for doing. But against the pacifists, they insisted that there was such thing as morally justifiable, appropriate violence and political use of force. And part of the way that they tried to develop and articulate these set of rights and war responsibilities was by establishing, as it were, a moral division of labor. So the categories, the basic categories of just war thinking were developed. And those were, and given their Latin terminology, the jus ad bellum, the so-called justice of war, just the rules pertaining to the permissibility of going to war, on the one hand, were directed at sovereigns, kings, and state leaders. And the jus ad bellum insisted most basically that war could only appropriately be fought when there was a just cause, preeminently that the just cause was that you had been attacked, so you were fighting a war of self-defense. There had to be other conditions as well. The war had to be declared by an appropriate authority, it had to be a last resort, it had to be proportionate, it had to be fought with right intention. But those set of rules concerning the justice of the war were really directed at the sovereign and at the government. On the other hand, there was a body of laws, of norms, called the jus in bello, literally the justice within war. And that told individual soldiers what their rights and obligations were when fighting within the war. Principally here, what it told you was that there was an obligation to discriminate. What that means is that a soldier is permitted to target an enemy soldier, an enemy combatant, but he is not permitted to directly or intentionally target a non-combatant, a civilian. His use of force had to be proportionate and it had to be necessary. So we have two bodies of rules. The jus ad bellum is directed primarily at sovereigns. The jus in bello is directed at soldiers. And again, we have this balance between the rights that it attributes and the responsibilities. And for soldiers, what that meant was that if they restricted themselves only to targeting enemy soldiers, enemy combatants, then their killing would be deemed to be morally permissible. It would not be deemed to be murder, would not be deemed to be morally impermissible, but it would be deemed to be morally appropriate. Now, I said that this was a remarkable view. One of the things that I think is remarkable about it is that it has survived for so long. Just war theory, as it's practiced today by scholars, and also as it has been implemented within the laws of war, because if you look at the basic structure of the laws of armed conflict, or international humanitarian law, as the humanitarians tend to call it, if you look at the laws of war, you will see that its basic principles and structures are essentially those of just war theory. That's not an accident or a coincidence. It's because international law as we have it today is a development precisely of that body of theory. It grew out of it, emerged from it. But if Aquinas or Augustine would come back to Earth today and were to sit in on a seminar or go to the ICC instead of an international, on a laws of war case, they would essentially recognize the main structure of what's going on. I can't think of any other basic platform of medieval thought that has survived into the 20th, 21st century. I think that just war theory is really unique in that sense, to have maintained well into the modern age. I started reading Michael Walzer and the modern theorists, and I started to become more and more convinced that there were fundamental problems with this worldview, with this view of just war theory. Now, some of those problems have to do with the incompleteness of just war theory. So as I said, in the traditional view, we divide it into two parts. Jus ad bellum, the ethics of going to war, and jus in bello, the ethics of behavior within war. But it didn't take too long, at least over the last decade or so, for people to realize that there was another element that was missing, which was what happened after the war was completed, the so-called jus post bellum, justice after the war. Now, in fact, this was an element of the tradition. If you look back into the tradition, you will find authors who wrote about jus post bellum, but it had been essentially forgotten, at least until the aftermath of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when people suddenly realize that it's actually kind of important to think about what happens after the war and to do that before and during the war itself. So jus post bellum started to become an area that scholars and legal theorists started to think about. But there was another element around the ethics of war and violence that was still missing, even from that tripartite, three-part distinction of the ethics of war into ad bellum, in bello, and post bellum. And this was an observation that was made almost at precisely the same time by myself and an American philosopher called Darrell Mollendorf. And what we noticed was that what was missing from the traditional accounts and the modern accounts also was an investigation of the conditions around the transition from a state of war back into a state of peace. And that is a set of considerations that I call jus terminatio. So think about it this way: just as jus ad bellum describes and governs the transition from a state of peace into a state of war, when is it ever appropriate to declare war and enter into a state of war? Jus terminatio is precisely about the reverse direction of travel. So it's the set of questions around when is a combatant or a combatant nation required to sue for peace? What are the steps that they ought to take in order to do that? How rapidly ought to do that? How ought they to sequence that transition? A whole area of discussion that had never been observed or worked upon in this whole ancient tradition, which is now receiving a lot of attention. So there were problems with the tradition about the completeness. We now have a much richer sense of that, with a four-part distinction: ad bellum, in bello, terminatio, and post bellum. And apologies for all of the Latin. I don't know how we got stuck into talking Latin with all of this, but it's an element of the longevity of that tradition. So there were problems around the completeness of the infrastructure, which, as I said, I think we have partly gone some way to addressing. But I started to come to believe that there were much more fundamental problems with the theory and its approach to the ethics of war. And to my way of thinking, these problems had to do with a fundamental tension between the idea within just war theory that there is such a thing as war rights. In other words, that there are moral permissions to engage in acts of war on the one hand, a tension between this idea of war rights on the one hand, and the idea which, at least since the Enlightenment, has come to occupy an absolutely central place in our moral and political thinking, which is the idea of universal human rights. Now, human rights, again, they had a longer intellectual tradition. They, in some ways, link back to the older tradition of medieval tradition of natural rights or natural law. But they really are a concept that becomes articulated in a recognizably modern form during the Enlightenment by a number of thinkers, but to my mind, most powerfully by Immanuel Kant, around the idea that individual persons are owed special kinds of moral protection because of the kinds of beings they are. In particular, because individual human subjects possess three fundamental moral attributes. They are, or we are, morally equal, we are free, and we are autonomous in the sense that we can define our own projects, respond to reasons, and define our own laws. And this idea that human agents, possessing, as it were, these three basic moral attributes, possess these certain kinds of moral protections that we call rights, is an extraordinarily powerful one. And it was developed over the centuries and, of course, burst into enormous political and legal prominence in the aftermath of the Second World War, with, first of all, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and then really the explosion of the legal instrumentation of human rights in instruments right the way across the globe, from within the European Union to national jurisdictions. So, to my mind, the development of this idea, both within law and within normative theory of human rights, has been the most significant development in our moral understanding of the world, at least in the last 70 years or so. And if the very, very fundamental core of the idea of human rights is the idea that there are certain basic protections enjoyed by persons that are, in some sense, theirs to dispose of. Right? So to say that I have a right to something is to say that I can surrender that right, for example, by giving you consent to act in a way that is contrary to it. I can contract it away, I can sell it, I can voluntarily alienate it, and I can also do things to alienate it through forfeiture. So, for example, I have the right to liberty, but if I break the law, my liberty can be constrained. So we understand rights as things that can be contracted away, consented away, and that can also be lost through certain kinds of wrongful action, such as losing your right to liberty by breaking the law, or to take another example that will become important, I can forfeit my right not to be killed in self-defense if I engage in a wrongful attack on another person. Right? So I can forfeit the right, I can lose the right, I can give it away, but the crucial thing about rights is they cannot be taken from me. The exercise of the right and the loss of the right is in some sense tied to my agency. It must be something that emerges from the way that I act and the kinds of actions that I undertake. That I take to be the most fundamental core idea, the idea of human rights. So, my belief came to be that there was a fundamental tension between the modern post-Enlightenment idea of human rights and the idea within just war theory that there is such a thing as war rights, the right to engage in war. Why might that be the case? Well, let's start with one problematic area and then push out from there. So we saw earlier that just war theory attributes to soldiers an equal set of rights and of responsibilities. So soldiers on both sides of a conflict have an equal responsibility not to target enemy civilians, but on the other side, they have an equal right to target enemy soldiers, to target enemy combatants. Now that right I describe as being equal because it is, in a sense, it's independent of the justice or otherwise of the war that you're fighting. So a soldier who is fighting in an unjust war of aggression gets the same war rights, also the same responsibilities, but he gets the same war rights as a soldier fighting for a just defensive war. Now, as I said before, that's implicit in the structure of just war theory and also of modern international law, and it's part of the way that that theory tries to navigate this middle way between pacifism and realism. But thought about from the perspective of fundamental human rights, that makes no sense whatsoever. So take a concrete case. Imagine, for example, my grandfather fighting for the Bundeswehr in an aggressive war in Russia. Let's imagine him firing his weapon at an enemy combatant who we're assuming is fighting lawfully and morally in defense of his own community against the aggressive invaders. The combatant on the other side that he is firing at, if we understand him in that way, has done nothing morally wrong. He's done nothing that could explain the fact that he has surrendered his basic human right not to be killed. So how could we understand the war acts of my grandfather as being morally justified? Think about a domestic analogy. You could imagine an armed policeman guarding a bank, and some armed bank robbers come in and try to rob the bank, and they start firing at the policeman, and the policeman starts firing back at them. And the robbers shoot at the policeman to save their own lives. It's pretty clear that they can't claim that their killing of the policeman was justified by reason of self-defense. Why? Well, it's pretty obvious. Although the policeman was threatening their life, he had a right to do that. He was not threatening their life in a way that was wrongful. So implicit in the idea of a right, implicit in the idea of the possibility of a forfeiture of a right, is making a distinction between those who act with justice, with right, and those who act without. And that basic observation is fundamentally incompatible with the idea that you find within modern international law and just war theory, that there are an equal set of war rights that belong to both sides of a combat. That cannot be true. So, we find the set of war rights shrinking as we apply modern concepts of human rights. We find that part of the war rights that were attributed by just war theory and international law are just unsustainable. They wither away, they shrink. But I think the problem goes even further than that. I think that there is a fundamental problem with our idea that there can be a right for states to engage in wars of national self-defense. And this is really a big issue because this is the fundamental paradigmatic right of war, both within the traditional theory and within modern international law. The idea that states, if, as the United Nations Charter puts it, if their territorial integrity and political sovereignty is threatened by a military invasion of another state, that they have the right to engage in a war of national self-defense. Now, that idea is in many ways a very, very intuitive one, and it's a very appealing one. And part of what makes it very appealing is that we often think of it in terms of an analogy. So we say, well, we all have rights to engage in self-defense. So if you and I were walking down the alley in Karlsruhe one dark night and I suddenly pulled out a knife and tried to stab you, you would have the right to kill me in self-defense. That's pretty clear and pretty obvious. And so then we say, well, states are kind of like individuals. And just as an individual has the right to life, so a state has the right to sovereign territorial integrity. So if another state attacks that state and threatens its sovereignty and territorial integrity, it kind of seems intuitively right that they should have the right to engage in a war of self-defense. That war of self-defense is just the state analog of your right to kill me if I pull out a knife on you on the dark alleyway in Karlsruhe. And there's a very nice graphic example of this. I don't know if any of you know this, but the original cover of Thomas Hobbes' great work of political philosophy, Leviathan, it's this wonderful illustration on the cover. So the Leviathan, the sovereign of the land, is depicted as this giant figure bestriding the countryside, and he's carrying a sword in one hand and he has a crown on his head. But when you look carefully at this figure, this kind of giant, this Leviathan, you see that he's made up of all of the tiny individual people within the state. Right? So it's a very powerful graphical representation of this idea. The state, as it were, is an individual constituted out of the individuals of that nation. So that's the kind of classical idea. And as I say, you can see it. It recurs again and again and again in political theory, in just war theory, and in legal writing, right throughout this tradition. I think it's a fundamentally flawed way of thinking about this relationship. If states possess a right of national self-defense, that has to be related to individual rights in one of two ways. Either it is a right of the collective, of the sovereign, of the political entity that is in some sense analogous to the rights of individuals, or it is a collective right that is, in a sense, reducible to the rights of individuals. What I mean by that is that if you explain it reductively, you say, well, we talk about a right of national self-defense, but really all that's happening, all that we're doing is we're describing a very, very complex exercise of the rights of lots and lots of individual people who are all defending themselves and each other. And they just do that in a complex way, and we call that the right of the state to national self-defense. But it's really just reducible to those rights of individuals. So what I tried to do in a book that I published some time ago called War and Self-Defense is to show that neither of those two approaches can explain the right of national self-defense that we find in international law and in just war theory. The analogical approach doesn't work because states are not moral entities, moral beings analogous to individuals. They are, as it were, artificial entities that get what rights they have out of the fact that they protect and defend the rights of individual persons. Their rights are entirely conditional on the rights of the genuine right bearers, which is us, the human beings, the people that are citizens of those states. So that analogical strategy, I think, does not work and cannot work. But the reductive strategy also does not work. And the reason for that is that there are many circumstances in which the right of a state to sovereignty and territorial integrity can be in direct conflict with the rights to life of individuals. So in my book, I gave an argument that I called the argument from bloodless invasion. And I said, imagine a case in which the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a state is threatened by an act of invasion that was entirely bloodless, right? It did not threaten the lives of any individual. The tanks and the soldiers roll in and they say, look, if we can have this territory and administer it, we won't shoot anyone, we won't kill anyone, but we're taking this over. In that situation, there's a direct conflict between the territorial and sovereign rights of the states and the rights to life and other basic interests of individual persons. And I remember at that time, a lot of people responded by saying, yeah, but that's a typical philosopher's example. Nothing like that would ever happen. Well, what's been interesting about the last 6 months is that we have had a real, genuine, living example of a bloodless invasion. So we have had the dismemberment of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine by the Soviet Union without, at least until very recently, without a shot being fired. A genuine living example of that. And what's interesting to me about the debate is that almost all of the political observers and legal observers have recognized, I would say, that really we do not possess a right to defend that sovereignty and that territorial integrity through war. I think there has been an implicit recognition right from the beginning. So that has been very, very interesting to me, the way that that's played out in the last 6 months. So those are two of the ways that I think that there is really a deep tension and contradiction between the idea of basic human rights derived from the Enlightenment, embedded in international law, really one of the cornerstone concepts of modern moral thinking, and just war theory. If we really believe in basic human rights, then big, big swathes of just war theory will have to be redefined, constrained, or eliminated. The restrictive side of just war theory, I think, stands and is very well explained by human rights. But the idea of war rights, the idea of permissions for states to engage in war, wars of self-defense even, the idea of the rights of individual soldiers to kill enemy combatants constricts and withers away. Now, I want to end by talking about a possible response to some of these arguments. So there's a very well-defined set of responses to this argument. And arguments like this, for those of you who have looked at the philosophical literature in the last 10 years, it's this approach that views the ethics of war from the perspective of human rights has come to be called revisionist just war theory, and it's really been an extremely fruitful and dynamic area of research over the last 10 years. It's completely redefined the field. But for those who want to defend the more traditional approach, just war theory and international law, the most common response is one along these lines. It says, look, you're probably right that at a very, very basic level, the concepts and categories that just war theory and international law are using are incoherent. They do not make sense at that level. But they are nonetheless important and morally and legally justified by the instrumental role that they play in moderating the horrors of war. And the argument goes roughly like this. It says, look, wars are inevitable. They have always been with us, and they will always be with us in the future. We cannot eliminate war. Because we cannot eliminate war, we have to do the second best thing. We have to moderate the evils and the harms that war entails. And one of the ways that we can do that is engaging in what an international lawyer friend of mine describes with a wonderful phrase: we have to engage in a Faustian bargain. And that Faustian bargain is essentially the one that I articulated right at the outset. It says to soldiers in a war, there are certain things you can't do, certain obligations that you have to abide by, but in return, there are certain permissions that you will get. So we will grant you the right, the legal permission and the moral permission to kill enemy combatants, even if you're fighting in an unjust war. But the flip side of it is that you have to follow the other rules of jus and bello. You can't target non-combatants, you can't shoot prisoners, you can't use disproportionate force, and so forth. So in that view, the entitlements that just war theory gives are entirely instrumental. It's part of this Faustian bargain. It's not something that's based in fundamental rights or fundamental law. It is simply a necessary package of rights and obligations that we have to grant to people to allow law to get a minimal amount of traction. Now, in response to this, I say a number of different things. First thing I say is, well, we have no idea whether what you're saying is true. Whether, in fact, entering this Faustian bargain does, in fact, incentivize people to behave in ways that will diminish overall harm. How would we know that? We can't run double-blind experiments. How do we know that? The second problem with it, I think, is that the rights that you bargain away in this Faustian pact are rights of really basic and fundamental importance. So let's get clear about what we're saying on this view of the world. What we're saying is that we will grant combatants fighting in an unjust war, the right, the legal and moral privilege to kill persons who are not liable to be killed, to commit murder, in other words. We will grant them the permission to commit murder so as to incentivize them not to commit other crimes. Is that a law? Is that an approach to moral theory that we could view as minimally morally justified? I don't believe so. So I have an example to try and demonstrate what that's so. So cast your mind back 200 years ago, slightly over 200 years ago now, at the time when the campaign to outlaw slavery was occurring in Britain. And imagine a well-disposed humanitarian who comes to you and says, look, it's wonderful that you're trying to ban slavery, David. But you know, slavery has been with us for the beginning of time. There will always be slavery. We don't have the option to eliminate it entirely from the world. But maybe what we can do is we can moderate it a little bit. We could put in place a set of rules that would moderate the worst excesses of slavery. So maybe we could regulate it. We could have a certain set of minimal standards for slaves. You know, they can only be beaten with certain kinds of instruments and not with others. You know, if you're going to rape them, you have to give certain kinds of protection and so forth. Or maybe, you know, maybe they can't be raped at all. Maybe they're really well treated, right? Maybe they get all kinds of protections, but they still stay slaves. That's roughly what the person proposing this view of the laws of war is saying. Right? He's saying it can be okay to give legal and moral permissions to violate fundamental rights of other people. In the case of slavery, it's the right to freedom, autonomy, the right not to be owned as a chattel by another human being. In this case, it's a right that's equally fundamental, the right not to be killed if you have done nothing to forfeit that right. What we're suggesting is bartering away the permission to violate a fundamental right in order to gain improvements in welfare. And what I want to say is that even if the argument about slavery were right, and it's not implausible to me that it may not be, even if you could have increased and improved overall aggregate welfare by having that kind of permissive regulatory approach to slavery, you morally ought not to do that. And you oughtn't to do that because the right not to be owned by another human being is a fundamental human right. Now, the final response that I want to make to this, and this is going to be my final point today, is that a really basic and fundamental question about the response, the Faustian Pact response, is whether it's in fact true that war can never be eliminated. Whether that is in fact true. Because if it's not true, then it's obvious that the whole argument entirely loses its intellectual and moral force. And what I want to say is that it's absolutely clear that it's not true. It is clear that war can be eliminated. We know this because it's happened. And as Aristotle said, the inference from the actual to the possible is always a valid one. Where has war been eliminated? It obviously has not been eliminated in totality in the world as a whole. But it has been eliminated in certain kinds of geographical and functional spaces. So I'm thinking about two examples here in particular. It has been eliminated in areas where we have put in place successful federal and quasi-federal systems. So think about, for example, the United States of America, or Australia, or my home now, the Swiss Federation, or, the most interesting of all, the European Union. Think, for example, what an incredible achievement the European Union is, to bind together 27 states with histories of war, atrocity, genocide, and murder going back millennia, now living within an institutional structure that has made war literally unthinkable. We have managed to do that. How have we managed to do that? Through intellectual, legal, and institutional innovation. And I think when you look back at the genesis of the European Union, the date, to my mind, to date that from, is Immanuel Kant's writing of Perpetual Peace. You look at the European Union today, and it is essentially, it is that blueprint brought to flesh and blood. So we know that we can do these things within geographical areas. Now, can this be extended? We know that it can. How far can it be? Could we conceive of including Turkey? Could we conceive of including Russia within that union? I don't know, but we know that it is possible. The second area that I want to suggest that we have effectively managed to tame and to eliminate warfare is not a geographical area, but a functional area. So if you go back a few hundred years, one of the most prominent causes for war was problems around secession and revolution, because of the intrinsic problems that exist within all dynastic modes of succession. That problem is essentially solved by democratic institutions. Because what democracy fundamentally does, what it enables you to do, is to conduct a revolution, as we would say in the UK, to kick the bums out, without having to go to war to do so. Now, we don't describe democracy as pacifist revolutionaryism, but when all's said and done, that's basically what it is. The fundamental virtue of democracy is the ability to conduct regime change in a way that does not necessitate going to war. Democracy has proved unbelievably powerful and successful at doing that. In fact, I don't know of any example of a revolutionary civil war that's occurred within a modern, fully developed, functioning democracy. And that is also a remarkable achievement. It's not a panacea, of course, because there are other causes for civil war. One of those, as we've seen very clearly in the Ukrainian case, is secessionist movements and secessionist wars. Now, there's a very good reason why democracy, although it's very good at dealing with issues of succession and revolutionary wars that arise from that, it's not very good at dealing with secessionist issues. Why? Well, because in order to have a vote on secession, you first have to know who is the population who's entitled to vote. But that's the whole point, right, with the secessionist challenge. So we don't have solutions to all parts of the puzzle, but we have some of them, and we know that solutions are possible. So when I look forward to the challenge of the next decades and the next 100 years and the next millennia, it's how to fill in those gaps, to find legal, intellectual, and institutional mechanisms for doing in peaceful ways what we do now or have done in the past through mechanisms of war. And that's why I remain an optimist against the pessimist, that war can indeed be tamed. Thank you very much.